In the ancient world, captive kings rarely lived to see freedom. They were symbols of conquered nations, reminders of imperial power, prisoners whose very existence threatened their captors. To release such a prisoner was not just unusual, it was revolutionary. This is the story of two kings, one who spent 37 years in a Babylonian prison, and another who chose mercy over tradition, compassion over politics, and in doing so, changed the course of history. The year was 562 BC. The Babylonian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, the most powerful civilization on earth. In the heart of this empire, in the great city of Babylon, a new king had just ascended to the throne. His name was Evil-Merodach, though his subjects knew him as Evil-Merodach, man of Marduk, and in the depths of the royal prison, an old man waited. His name was Jehoiachin, and he had once been king of Judah. For 37 years he had lived in captivity, a forgotten relic of a conquered kingdom, until the day everything changed. To understand this extraordinary story, we must journey back nearly 4 decades, to the time when the greatest king in Babylonian history set his sights on a small kingdom in the hills of Palestine.
The conquest of Jerusalem. The year was 605 BC. Nebuchadnezzar II had just become king of Babylon, inheriting an empire his father had built through conquest and diplomacy. But Nebuchadnezzar had grander ambitions. He would make Babylon the wonder of the world, and every nation would bow before its magnificence. Standing in his way was a collection of small kingdoms along the Mediterranean coast, stubbornly clinging to their independence. Among them was Judah, with its mountain capital of Jerusalem and its young king, Jehoiakim. Nebuchadnezzar's first campaign against Jerusalem came swiftly. The Babylonian war machine was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Massive siege engines, disciplined infantry, and cavalry units moved with terrifying precision across the landscape. Jerusalem's walls, which had protected the city for centuries, seemed suddenly fragile against this overwhelming force. King Jehoiakim, faced with annihilation, made the only choice he could. He surrendered. But Nebuchadnezzar was not merely a conqueror, he was a strategist. Rather than destroy Jerusalem completely, he chose a different path. He would leave the city standing, but he would take its most precious treasures, the sacred vessels from Solomon's temple, and the brightest young men from the royal family and nobility. Among these captives was an 18-year-old prince named Daniel, who would later become one of history's most famous prisoners. But this was only the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's plan for Judah. For 11 years, Jerusalem remained a vassal state, paying tribute to Babylon. But kingdoms dream of freedom, and in 597 BC, King Jehoiakim made a fatal decision. He rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. The rebellion was short-lived. Jehoiakim died during the siege, whether from natural causes or assassination, history does not record. His 18-year-old son, Jehoiachin, inherited not a kingdom, but a death sentence.
The young king's brief reign. Jehoiachin's reign lasted exactly 3 months and 10 days. In those brief weeks, he faced impossible choices. Should he surrender and hope for mercy? Should he fight and watch his people die? Should he flee and abandon his responsibility? The weight of kingship, thrust upon him in his nation's darkest hour, would have crushed a lesser man. But Jehoiachin chose the path of sacrifice. When Nebuchadnezzar's armies surrounded Jerusalem once again, the young king made a decision that would define his life. He walked out of the city gates and surrendered himself to save his people. The ancient chronicles record the moment with stark simplicity. Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his mother, his servants, his princes, and his officials went out to the king of Babylon, and the king of Babylon took him captive. But behind those simple words lay a drama of extraordinary courage. Here was a teenager, barely old enough to rule, choosing captivity to prevent the slaughter of his people. It was an act of selflessness that would echo through the centuries. Nebuchadnezzar was impressed by the young king's courage, but he was not moved to mercy. Jehoiachin was taken to Babylon along with 10,000 of Jerusalem's finest citizens, craftsmen, warriors, nobles, and priests. The cream of an entire civilization, transported 1,000 miles from their homeland to serve the glory of Babylon. And to ensure that Judah would never rise again, Nebuchadnezzar placed Jehoiachin's uncle, Zedekiah, on the throne as a puppet king. It seemed that the story of Jehoiachin was over before it had truly begun.
Life in the Babylonian prison. What does it mean to be a captive king? In ancient Babylon, royal prisoners occupied a strange position in society. They were too dangerous to release, too valuable to execute, and too symbolic to ignore. Jehoiachin was housed in the royal prison complex, a series of chambers beneath the great palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Archaeological excavations have uncovered ration lists from this period, administrative records that provide a remarkable window into daily life in captivity. These clay tablets, discovered in the ruins of Babylon, record food allowances for various prisoners and dependents of the crown. And there, inscribed in cuneiform script, are the words that bring this ancient story to life. Jehoiachin, king of Judah. The records show that even in captivity, Jehoiachin retained his royal title. He received regular food rations, not just for himself, but for his sons and his attendants. Nebuchadnezzar may have taken his freedom, but he had not stripped him of his dignity. But what sustained a man through 37 years of imprisonment? What hope could survive nearly 4 decades of captivity? For Jehoiachin, the answer lay in faith and identity. He remained, in his own mind and in the minds of his people, the legitimate king of Judah. In the Jewish communities scattered throughout Babylon, dates were still recorded according to the years of Jehoiachin's reign, as if he were ruling from exile. This was more than mere sentiment. It was a profound act of resistance. By maintaining Jehoiachin's royal status, even in prison, the Jewish exiles were declaring that Babylon's conquest was temporary, that their true allegiance lay with their captured king, and that someday, somehow, restoration would come. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the puppet king Zedekiah proved unable to resist the same temptations that had destroyed his predecessors. In 586 BC, exactly 11 years after Jehoiachin's capture, Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's response was swift and merciless. This time, there would be no mercy for Jerusalem. The city was besieged for 2.5 years until famine and desperation broke its will to resist. When Jerusalem finally fell, Nebuchadnezzar's revenge was terrible. The temple was burned, the walls were torn down, and the remaining population was carried into exile. Zedekiah was forced to watch the execution of his own sons before his own eyes were put out. The kingdom of Judah ceased to exist. But in his Babylonian prison, Jehoiachin lived on. The last legitimate king of an obliterated nation,
He had become something more valuable than a political prisoner. He had become a symbol of hope for an entire people. The madness of Nebuchadnezzar. As Jehoiachin entered his second decade of captivity, the mighty Nebuchadnezzar began to show signs of the instability that would define his final years. The great king, who had conquered nations and built wonders, was succumbing to a form of madness that ancient texts describe in vivid detail. According to the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar was driven from human society, living like a wild animal, eating grass like cattle, his hair growing like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. Modern scholars debate whether this was a psychological breakdown, a political exile, or a combination of both. Whatever the precise nature of Nebuchadnezzar's condition, it created a power vacuum in the Babylonian court. During this period, the day-to-day administration of the empire fell to his son, Evil-Merodach, the prince who would later be known to biblical writers as Evil-Merodach. This was the young man's introduction to power, and it shaped his understanding of kingship in profound ways. He saw firsthand how absolute authority could corrupt and destroy even the greatest leaders. He witnessed the fragility of human power and the importance of wisdom over strength. When Nebuchadnezzar eventually recovered his sanity, he had been transformed by his experience. The arrogant conqueror had become a man humbled by suffering, someone who understood that even kings were subject to forces beyond their control. This new Nebuchadnezzar took a more active role in mentoring his son, sharing not just the mechanics of ruling an empire, but the deeper wisdom he had gained through his trials. It was an education that would prove crucial when Evil-Merodach faced his own moment of choice. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC after 43 years on the throne. He left behind the largest empire the world had ever seen, architectural wonders that would be remembered for millennia, and a son who had learned to rule not just with power, but with wisdom. The new king took the throne name Evil-Merodach, man of Marduk, invoking the patronage of Babylon's chief deity. But the Hebrew scribes who recorded his story knew him by a different name, Evil-Merodach, which simply meant the man Merodach, a title that said nothing about his character, despite its ominous sound to modern ears.
The new king's dilemma. Evil-Merodach inherited more than an empire when he became king. He inherited the accumulated prisoners, policies, and prejudices of his father's long reign. Among the most significant of these inheritances was the question of what to do with the captive kings who had been languishing in Babylonian prisons for decades. Chief among these was Jehoiachin of Judah, now a man in his 50s who had spent more than half his life in captivity. From a purely practical standpoint, he represented no threat to Babylonian security. His kingdom had been destroyed 11 years earlier, his people were scattered across the empire, and he had no army, no treasury, no power base from which to mount a rebellion. But practical considerations were only part of the equation. In ancient Near Eastern politics, the treatment of captive royalty sent powerful messages about the character and intentions of a new ruler. To execute such prisoners would signal ruthless authority, but might also provoke unrest among their peoples. To maintain their captivity indefinitely was the safe choice, but it was also an admission that they remained threats. To release them, however, would be unprecedented. Such an act would signal either extraordinary confidence or dangerous weakness, depending on how it was perceived by the international community and by the king's own subjects. For Evil-Merodach, the decision about Jehoiachin was complicated by factors his father had never faced. The new king was young, untested, and surrounded by court officials who had served Nebuchadnezzar for decades. Any significant policy change would be scrutinized for signs of weakness or inexperience.
Moreover, the Jewish community in Babylon had grown large and influential during the decades of exile. They were skilled craftsmen, successful merchants, and valuable contributors to the empire's economy. Their loyalty mattered, and their opinion of the new king would be significantly influenced by how he treated their captive monarch. Ancient texts suggest that Evil-Merodach was a different kind of ruler than his father. Where Nebuchadnezzar had been imperious and demanding, the new king was more reflective and consultative. Where his father had ruled through fear and intimidation, Evil-Merodach seemed to prefer building consensus and loyalty. This difference in style may have reflected the lessons learned during Nebuchadnezzar's years of madness, when Evil-Merodach had seen firsthand how the exercise of absolute power could lead to absolute isolation. Or it may simply have reflected his own natural temperament and the influence of advisors who favored a more diplomatic approach to governance. Whatever the source of his inclinations, Evil-Merodach faced a choice that would define his reign and his legacy. He could follow precedent, maintaining the policies of his predecessors and keeping Jehoiachin in comfortable but permanent captivity. Or he could risk everything on an act of unprecedented mercy that might transform his relationship with one of the most significant communities in his empire. The decision he made would echo through history.
The liberation. On a day that Jewish scribes would carefully record for posterity, the 27th day of the 12th month, in the 37th year of Jehoiachin's exile, King Evil-Merodach made a decision that defied every precedent in ancient Near Eastern politics. He ordered the release of Jehoiachin from prison. But this was not simply a matter of opening prison doors. What Evil-Merodach did next was even more extraordinary. He elevated Jehoiachin above all the other captive kings in Babylon, gave him a seat at the royal table, and provided him with a daily allowance for the rest of his life. The biblical account, recorded in both the books of Kings and Jeremiah, is precise in its details. Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, lifted up the head of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, out of prison. And he spoke kindly to him, and set his throne above the throne of the kings that were with him in Babylon. The language here is significant. To lift up the head was an idiom meaning to restore honor and dignity. To speak kindly implied not just politeness, but genuine respect and care. And to set Jehoiachin's throne above those of other captive kings was to acknowledge his special status among the exiled royalty. This was not merely mercy, it was rehabilitation. Evil-Merodach was not just freeing a prisoner, he was restoring a king. The practical implications of this decision were enormous. Jehoiachin was given new clothes to replace his prison garments, a public declaration that his years of captivity were officially over. He was provided with a regular place at the royal table, eating the same food as the king himself, a privilege reserved for the highest officials of the realm. Most importantly, he was granted a daily allowance that would continue for the rest of his life. This was not charity, but recognition. Evil-Merodach was acknowledging Jehoiachin as a legitimate king, deserving of royal treatment, even though his kingdom no longer existed. The impact on the Jewish community in Babylon was immediate and profound. For 37 years, they had maintained their faith in Jehoiachin's legitimacy, dating their documents according to the years of his reign, preserving his royal status, even in captivity. Now their faithfulness had been vindicated in the most public way possible. Their king had been restored not by their own efforts, but by the grace of their former enemy. It was a moment of redemption that would shape Jewish understanding of divine providence for generations to come. But why did Evil-Merodach make this unprecedented decision? The ancient texts provide no explicit explanation, leaving historians to piece together the motivations behind this remarkable act of mercy. Some scholars suggest it was a calculated political move, designed to win the loyalty of the Jewish community and demonstrate the new king's benevolent character. Others argue it reflected genuine personal conviction, perhaps influenced by the wisdom traditions that emphasized the importance of mercy and justice in royal governance. There may also have been family considerations. Evil-Merodach had grown up in a palace where Jehoiachin was a permanent fixture, a living reminder of his father's victories, but also of the human cost of conquest. It's possible that the new king had developed some personal sympathy for the captive monarch over the years. Moreover, the experience of watching his own father's descent into madness may have given Evil-Merodach a deeper appreciation for the fragility of human power and the importance of treating others with compassion, knowing that circumstances could change at any moment. Whatever his motivations, Evil-Merodach's decision to free and honor Jehoiachin was an act of extraordinary courage. It challenged the fundamental assumptions about how empires should treat conquered peoples, and it demonstrated a form of leadership that valued mercy over intimidation. In a world where power was typically measured by the ability to crush enemies, Evil-Merodach chose instead to measure his power by his ability to lift up the fallen.
The ripple effects. The liberation of Jehoiachin sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. News of the event traveled along the trade routes that connected Babylon to every corner of the known world, carrying with it questions about what this unprecedented act of mercy might mean for the future of the empire. In the Jewish communities scattered across Babylon and beyond, the response was immediate and profound. Suddenly, the impossible had become possible. Their king, whom they had mourned as dead to the world, had been restored to honor and dignity. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For a people who had lost their homeland, their temple, and their independence, the elevation of Jehoiachin represented something far more valuable than political restoration. It represented hope. Hope that exile was not permanent, that God had not forgotten them, and that their identity as a people could survive even the destruction of their nation. This hope would prove to be one of the most powerful forces in human history. It sustained the Jewish people through centuries of persecution and diaspora, ultimately leading to their return to the land of Israel and the rebuilding of their temple under Persian rule. But the implications extended far beyond the Jewish community. Other captive peoples within the Babylonian Empire watched with interest to see whether this mercy would extend to them as well. The Egyptians, Phoenicians, and other conquered nations began to hope that their own kings and leaders might receive similar treatment. Evil-Merodach's decision had established a new precedent in international relations, suggesting that conquest need not mean permanent subjugation, that empires could demonstrate their strength through magnanimity rather than cruelty. However, not everyone in Babylon viewed these developments positively. The old guard of Nebuchadnezzar's court, the generals and administrators who had built their careers on the principle of absolute authority, saw Evil-Merodach's policies as dangerous signs of weakness. They worried that mercy toward conquered peoples would be interpreted as an invitation to rebellion. They feared that elevating former enemies would undermine the respect and fear that had kept the empire stable for decades. These concerns were not entirely unfounded. Empires in the ancient world maintained their cohesion through a careful balance of benefits and threats. Show too much mercy, and subject peoples might begin to test the limits of imperial tolerance. Show too little,
and they might despair of peaceful coexistence and resort to violent resistance. Evil-Merodach was walking a tightrope, trying to demonstrate both strength and compassion, both authority and benevolence. It was a balancing act that few rulers had ever attempted, and even fewer had sustained for any length of time. The king's critics would eventually have their way. After reigning for only 2 years, Evil-Merodach was assassinated in a palace coup led by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar. The official records claim he was killed for his illegal acts, though they do not specify what those acts might have been. Modern historians suspect that his merciful policies, including the liberation of Jehoiachin, were among the illegal acts that cost him his throne and his life. The old guard had decided that compassion was a luxury the empire could not afford. But the precedent had been set. Even after Evil-Merodach's death, Jehoiachin retained his privileged position at the Babylonian court. His restoration had become irreversible, a fact that would have profound implications for the future of the Jewish people. When the Persian Empire conquered Babylon less than 2 decades later, they found a Jewish community that had maintained its identity and leadership structure through nearly 70 years of exile. This continuity made possible the eventual return to Jerusalem under Cyrus the Great and the rebuilding of the temple under Ezra and Nehemiah. In the long sweep of history, Evil-Merodach's brief reign might seem insignificant. He ruled for only 2 years and left no great monuments or military conquests to mark his legacy. But his decision to free Jehoiachin helped preserve one of the world's most influential civilizations and demonstrated that even in the ancient world, mercy could be stronger than fear.
The legacy of mercy. Jehoiachin lived out his remaining years in the strange position of being a king without a kingdom, honored by his captors, but unable to return to his homeland. The biblical record tells us that he ate bread continually before the king of Babylon all the days of his life, suggesting that his privileged status continued not just under Evil-Merodach, but under subsequent Babylonian rulers as well. This continuity speaks to the wisdom of Evil-Merodach's original decision. By treating Jehoiachin with honor rather than humiliation, he had transformed a potential source of unrest into a symbol of Babylonian magnanimity. Even Evil-Merodach's successors recognized the value of maintaining this arrangement. For Jehoiachin personally, these final years must have been bittersweet. He had regained his dignity and comfort, but he would never see Jerusalem again. He had been restored to royal status, but his kingdom remained a memory. He lived in honor, but it was the honor of exile. Yet his very survival was remarkable. In an age when captive kings were typically executed or forgotten, he had not only lived, but thrived. His restoration sent a message that resonated far beyond his own lifetime, that hope could survive even the darkest circumstances, that mercy was possible even in the most brutal political systems. The story of Jehoiachin's liberation also reveals important truths about the nature of courage and leadership. Evil-Merodach's decision to free the captive king required tremendous personal bravery. He was challenging the established order, risking the displeasure of his advisors, and potentially undermining his own authority. But true leadership sometimes requires such risks. The greatest leaders in history are often those who choose to do what is right rather than what is safe, who are willing to challenge convention when convention perpetuates injustice. From a theological perspective, Jewish and Christian traditions have long seen the liberation of Jehoiachin as a sign of divine providence. The God who had allowed his people to be conquered and exiled had not abandoned them entirely. Even in captivity, even through the actions of foreign kings, his mercy continued to work for their ultimate restoration.
This understanding would become central to Jewish theology during the centuries of diaspora that followed. The belief that God could work through foreign rulers, that he could turn the hearts of kings toward mercy, that he could use even exile and suffering for ultimate good. These ideas sustained the Jewish people through their darkest hours. The story also speaks to the power of persistence and faithfulness. For 37 years, the Jewish community in Babylon had maintained their loyalty to Jehoiachin, continuing to date their documents according to his reign, preserving his royal status even when it seemed hopeless. Their faithfulness was ultimately vindicated by his restoration. It was a lesson they would carry forward, that maintaining hope and identity in the face of overwhelming odds could sometimes bring unexpected rewards. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Evil-Merodach and Jehoiachin demonstrates that individual choices matter even in the vast sweep of history. A single decision by a young king to show mercy rather than maintain tradition helped preserve an entire civilization and change the course of religious history. In our modern world, where it's easy to feel powerless in the face of vast systems and institutions, this ancient story reminds us that individual acts of courage and compassion can have consequences far beyond what we can imagine.
Epilogue: Echoes Through Time. In the liberation of Jehoiachin took place over 2.5 millennia ago, yet its echoes continue to reverberate through our modern world. The principles that motivated Evil-Merodach's unprecedented act of mercy, the belief that human dignity transcends political circumstances, that mercy can be stronger than fear, that even enemies deserve compassion, these principles continue to challenge and inspire us today. In our own time, we have witnessed similar moments when individual leaders chose mercy over convention, when the powerful chose to lift up the powerless rather than maintain systems of oppression. The liberation of political prisoners, the restoration of dignity to the marginalized, the extension of rights to the disenfranchised. These modern movements echo the ancient decision of a Babylonian king to free a captive monarch. The story also reminds us of the importance of preserving hope and identity in the face of overwhelming challenges. Just as the Jewish community in Babylon maintained their loyalty to Jehoiachin through decades of exile, oppressed peoples throughout history have found ways to preserve their dignity and dreams even under the most difficult circumstances. This preservation of hope and identity has often proved to be the foundation for eventual liberation and restoration. Communities that maintain their sense of purpose and their belief in a better future are often those best positioned to seize opportunities when they arise. But perhaps the most important lesson from this ancient story is the reminder that mercy is not weakness, it is strength. Evil-Merodach demonstrated that a ruler could show compassion without compromising authority, that treating former enemies with dignity could actually enhance rather than diminish imperial power. In our modern world, where strength is often measured by the ability to dominate or destroy opponents, this ancient example suggests a different model of leadership, one based on the courage to lift others up rather than tear them down. The clay tablets that record Jehoiachin's food rations in Babylonian captivity were discovered by archaeologists in the ruins of ancient Babylon, tangible proof that this remarkable story actually happened. These simple administrative records, noting the daily bread allocated to a captive king, connect us across the millennia to a moment when mercy triumphed over tradition. They remind us that behind every historical account are real human beings, a young king choosing captivity to save his people, an old man maintaining hope through decades of imprisonment, a new ruler deciding to show unprecedented compassion to a former enemy's son. In the end,
The story of Evil-Merodach and Jehoiachin is not just ancient history. It is a timeless testament to the power of mercy, the importance of hope, and the difference that individual courage can make in shaping the course of human events. It challenges us to consider our own responses to those who are powerless, our own willingness to show mercy when we have the opportunity, and our own capacity to maintain hope and dignity even in the most difficult circumstances. The king who freed a king lived only 2 years after his act of unprecedented mercy, but the consequences of his decision echoed through centuries, helping to preserve a people, a faith, and a set of values that continue to influence our world today. In choosing mercy over tradition, compassion over convention, Evil-Merodach, Evil-Merodach demonstrated that even in the ancient world, the most powerful force was not the sword or the throne, but the human capacity for redemption. And in the ruins of Babylon, among the clay tablets that record the mundane details of an empire long fallen, we find the simple notation that Jehoiachin, king of Judah, received his daily bread, a permanent reminder that mercy, once granted, can last forever. In memory of all who have chosen mercy over fear, and in hope for all who await their own moment of restoration.